I never thought I'd be a single father at 35. Every morning, I force myself to get up at 6:30, make breakfast for Tommy, try to keep our lives as normal as possible. But it's hard. So hard. The house feels different now. Empty, silent. Sometimes I catch myself staring at her coffee mug, still sitting in the kitchen cabinet where she left it. I haven't touched it. I can't. Tommy, my 5-year-old, he's been surprisingly strong through all this. Maybe too strong. When Sarah left me, he didn't cry. Not once. Which is strange, considering how close they were. He just keeps smiling, playing with his toys as if nothing has changed. The first few weeks were the worst. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see her face. Her expression in those final moments. No, I can't think about that. I need to stay strong. Lately, though, something's been off. I'm constantly exhausted, but it's more than just emotional fatigue. There's this heaviness. It started in my head like a fog that wouldn't lift. Then my shoulders began to ache, as if carrying an invisible burden. I've been taking sleeping pills, but they didn't help much. Sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of something, a shadow, a silhouette. But when I turn, there's nothing there, just empty rooms and silent walls. The worst part? The garden. I used to love gardening with Sarah. Now I can't even look at it. The soil seems different, darker. The roses she planted are growing wild, their thorns sharper than ever, their blooming blood red this year. Tommy still goes out there to play sometimes. Yesterday, I saw him talking to himself near the rose bushes. When I asked him who he was talking to, he just smiled and said, "Mommy's flowers are pretty this year, aren't they, Daddy?" I had to turn away. I couldn't let him see my face. The exhaustion is getting worse. At work, I can barely focus. My colleagues keep asking me if I'm okay. I must look terrible. I tell them I'm just having trouble sleeping, still adjusting to being a single parent. They nod sympathetically, probably thinking about Sarah left me for another man. If only they knew. No. Stop, I can't think like that. The weight on my shoulders has become almost unbearable. Sometimes I find myself hunched over as if something's pressing down on me. The doctor says it's stress. Prescribed me some pills, but pills can't fix this. They can't fix what happened. Last night was particularly bad. I was washing dishes when I caught a reflection in the kitchen window. For a split second, I thought I saw Sarah standing behind me. When I turned around, there's nothing there, but the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of her perfume. That sweet floral scent she always wore, the same scent that still lingers in the garden soil. Tommy's behavior is starting to unnerve me. He's always been a happy child, but this is different. He hums himself while playing the same lullaby Sarah used to sing. Sometimes I hear him laughing and talking in his room late at night. When I check on him, he's always alone, but his toys are arranged in a perfect circle, as if he's been having a tea party. This morning, he asked me something strange over breakfast. "Why do you look so tired? Is it because you're carrying Mommy?" I nearly choked on my coffee. "What do you mean, buddy?" He just smiled and went back to his cereal, humming that damn lullaby again. The roses in the garden are growing faster than they should. Their roots must be reaching deep, feeding on. No, I need to stop. I need to focus on keeping it together for Tommy. But this weight today, everything fell apart, literally. I was standing in the kitchen, trying to make dinner, when the room started spinning. The weight on my shoulders had become crushing, like someone was hanging onto my back. My knees buckled. The last thing I heard before hitting the floor was the sound of small footsteps running down the hallway. "Daddy, wake up." Tommy's voice pulled me back to consciousness. I was lying face down on the kitchen floor, the cold tiles pressing against my cheek. as I struggled to push myself up. My shoulders screamed in protest. It felt like my spine was being compressed by an invisible force. I managed to get to my knees, coming face to face with Tommy. His expressions wasn't scared or worried. He looked almost amused. The kitchen lights flickered above us, casting strange shadows on his small face. "Tommy," I wheezed, the pressure on my back making it hard to speak. "Don't you ever feel lonely? Now that Mommy's gone?" His head had tilted, looking at me with those innocent eyes, Sarah's eyes. Then he smiled that sweet, childish smile that usually warmed my heart. But this time, it sent a chill down my spine. "But Daddy," he said, his voice light and cheerful, "Mommy never left. She's always with us." My throat went dry. "What do you mean, buddy?" Tommy giggled, that same giggle he used to share with Sarah during their private jokes. "Silly Daddy. Mommy rides on your back every day. That's why you're so tired." The room started spinning again, and this time it wasn't from exhaustion. The weight on my shoulders suddenly felt different, more defined, more human. I could feel something pressing against my back, arms wrapped around my neck, legs gripping my waist. Something wet dripped onto my shoulder. When I touched it, my fingers came away red. Tommy was still smiling, still humming that lullaby. "Mommy says the roses need more water, Daddy. She says they're growing really well while you planted her. She says they're growing really well where you planted her. I can feel her now. Even as I write this, her weight on my back, her cold arms around my neck. Tommy's in his room having a tea party. I can hear him talking to someone, laughing. The roses are blooming beautifully this year, blood red and thorny, feeding on what lies beneath. And Sarah never left. She's still here, still watching, still riding on my back." This had happened to me about 6 years ago. I was doing my usual routine of walking around town for a few hours as I enjoyed walking, and I was getting my steps in for the day. I'd always start from my house, walk around town for a few hours, then turn around and head back home. I'd always go walking around noon or an hour or two later at the latest. My walks would start at 11 a.m. at the earliest or 2 p.m. at the latest. This day in particular, I had a bunch of things to do, so I was unable to go out walking before noon. I'd eventually finish up everything that I needed to do, but it was already in the mid to late afternoon. I checked the time and it was almost 3 p.m. I debated whether or not if I should go walking, or if I should go tomorrow instead, since I had nothing going on the next day. I decided to go for my walk, but I told myself that I'd cut it short since I don't want to be out late after sunset, since it would get pretty cold at night. I got dressed and headed out to get to my walk for the day. Fast forward almost 3 hours later, I looked at my phone to check the time, saw that it was almost 6 p.m., and started to make my way back home. I had a bit of a problem, which was I was about 6 miles away from my house, and it would take me about an hour and a half to get there. The sun had fully gone down, and there was only a faint orange glow in the sky from it. The night sky had begun to take over, and the air was turning cold. I began to make my way home, and had picked up the pace as I didn't want to be outside when it was cold. I was about 2 miles away from my home, and thought I was in the clear when I was wrong. I passed by a convenience store when I noticed a man sitting on the side of the building smoking a cigarette. The man looked to be in his early to mid-30s, wore a black hoodie, black pants, and black shoes. I saw him turn his head towards me, and he gave me a blank stare. I thought nothing of it and just ignored it. I turned around a few moments later and saw he had gotten up from his spot and began walking the same direction I was going. I kept checking behind me often to see if he would turn down another street, but he never did. After several minutes of him walking the same way as me, I hear the man start yelling, "Hey," but then started saying other stuff to try to get my attention, which I ignored. I heard him yell, "What the hell?" at me in an angry tone. I sped up, and I didn't dare to look back at this point. I texted my dad and explained that there's some creepy guy following me, and how he was yelling at me. My dad replies asking me how far I am, and I say about less than a mile away. He replies back to keep walking, "Don't worry," and that he'll come and get me in the next few minutes. I turned behind me to see if he's still following me, as he stopped yelling, and he was, unfortunately. I was 3/4 of a mile away from my house, and I thought about just running there. At the same time, I didn't want this guy to follow me and find out where I lived. I was about to turn down the street I lived, when something told me not to. I texted my dad and I told him I passed the street, and to go the other way, which he replied with "okay." I kept going forward, passing the street, when all of a sudden, I heard some kind of frantic noise. I turned around only to see, to my horror, that the guy put his hood up and was sprinting straight towards me. Without hesitation, I bolted straight ahead and ran across the street. I kept running for what felt like hours, until I saw a pair of headlights coming down the street. I waved my arms like a madman, hoping they would see me. Thankfully, they did, and the car stopped. I got closer and saw it was my dad. I looked behind me, only to see that the man who was chasing me had somehow disappeared. I got in the car and explained everything to my dad. He said he was going to drive down the street to see if he could find the man and could confront him. We drove down the street, only to see nobody walking on the sidewalk or hiding behind the bushes. There was no sign of anyone being out on the streets, as they were empty. From that day on, I never go out walking after 2 p.m., and since then, carry a pocket knife with me whenever I go out walking for my own safety and protection. I don't know what that man would have done to me had he caught me, and I don't think I ever want to know. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, a getaway from the stress of work and the chaos of life. I packed my gear, loaded up the truck, and headed to a remote lake in northern Minnesota, far away from the noise of civilization. Before I left, though, I stopped by a bait shop on the edge of town to stock up on supplies. The place was old, with faded signs and dusty shelves, but the owner seemed friendly enough. A grizzled man in his 60s who looked like he'd spent most of his life outdoors. "You're headed up to Coldwater Lake?" he asked, handing me a bundle of waxworms. "Yeah," I replied, trying to match his casual tone. He paused for a moment, his weathered face tightening. "Be careful out there. It's not just the cold you've got to watch for." I laughed nervously, thinking he was referring to thin ice or maybe bears. "What do you mean?" He leaned in closer, lowering his voice like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "Strange things happen up there. People hear sounds, see things. Folks around here don't like to talk about it, but you do well to keep your eyes open and your fire burning." I chuckled awkwardly, brushing it off as local superstition. "Thanks for the tip," I said, paying for my supplies and heading out the door. But as I walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the look in his eyes. Something between fear and pity. It stayed with me during the drive, and when I finally arrived at the lake, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. Like I said, before it was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, the locals warned me about the weather. They said the cold could seep into your bones and never leave, but I wasn't worried. The ice fished a dozen times before. Though I knew the dangers, I was wrong. The lake was a vast frozen sheet of white, surrounded by dense pine trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. I set up my tent in the middle of the lake. I drilled a hole in the ice and settled in for what I hoped would be a peaceful day of fishing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. The stillness of the lake became unnerving. No wind, no sounds, just silence. It was as if the world had been put on mute. That's when I heard it, a faint, distant scream. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the cry of an owl. It was human, but not quite. A wail that carried pain, hunger, and something primal. I froze, my breath fogging the air as I strained to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, echoing across the icy expanse. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew better. The ice beneath me groaned and cracked, a sound every ice fisherman fears. But this wasn't the natural settling of the ice. It felt purposeful, as if something massive was moving beneath me. Panic set in. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the lake. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the trees, a figure stood, tall and impossibly thin. Its eyes glowed like embers in the darkness, piercing through the shadows and locking onto me. Antlers jutted from its head, twisted and jagged, and its skeletal face was stretched into a horrific grin. It stepped onto the ice with unnatural grace. Its long clawed hands dragging against the surface. The scream came again, but this time it was in my head, a deafening roar that filled my mind with images of starvation, death, and despair. I scrambled to pack my gear, my hands shaking so bad I could barely zip my bag. The creature moved closer, its body convulsing as if it were struggling to contain itself, its teeth jagged and yellow, gnashed together in anticipation. Then it stopped. It tilted its head as if studying me, and let out a guttural hiss that sent chills down my spine. Without thinking, I grabbed the propane heater and hurled it towards the beast. The flames erupted on impact and the Wendigo shrieked, a sound so inhuman and agonizing that I thought my eardrums would burst. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran, leaving everything behind, my boots pounding against the ice until I reached a truck. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview window. The lake was empty, but I swear I could still hear the faint echo of that scream, following me through the night. I haven't gone ice fishing since. And when people ask why, I just tell them the truth. There's something out there in the cold. Something that doesn't belong in this world, and it's hungry. Southern Appalachia, western North Carolina, 30 minutes outside the town of Asheville. The hills and hollers, the Appalachian Mountains, are some of the oldest mountains in the world. Some of the rock formations dating back over 1 billion years. That quite literally means they were here before there were terrestrial animals. As with the most things that have been on the earth a long time, there are inexplainable anomalies, both benevolent and malevolent. For example, the Brown Mountain Lights. Never in my life have I felt threatened or uneasy when witnessing them. Wise man's view. They are neither good nor evil, they just are. On the benevolent side, sometimes when you walk through an abandoned old church, up near mom and dad's property line, you can feel good, warm, and happy energy. It's like that first warm day of summer when the sunshine is not too hot, but it's not too cold. Well, this story is not about one such anomaly, about something that was definitely malevolent. About a decade ago, I was in night school up at AB Tech, going to school for automotive mechanics. I would go into class at about 2 p.m. after I got off my part-time job, and I would end up getting home at about 10:30 p.m., depending on traffic. Every night, I drove the same road in my old 1973 W200 Dodge pickup. Some nights it would get rather boring, and I would take a different route, jump off of I-40 and drive the back roads. On this particular evening, I decided to just stay on I-40 because I just wanted to go home and go to bed. It was Thursday and there's no class on Friday, and I wanted to get in bed early so I could go out into the woods, go hiking early morning, watch the sun come up. As I jumped off of I-40 onto the exit where my parents lived, night seemed to get darker and none of the animals that I could hear through my rolled down windows made any more noise. The cab of my truck became smaller, my breathing quickened. I have never faced any kind of anxiety in my life, but at that moment, something felt off. There was no way I could put my finger on what it was. I came to a stop on the exit ramp, turned to go down the road, and I happened to notice that the gas station of the exit where mom and dad lived had no lights on. They were a 24-hour truck stop and always had lights on, but I didn't think about it again after noticing. I just chalked it up to the power being out, but I could not shake the feeling. Something was definitely askew. I slowly shifted through all of my truck's gears, not wanting to make any more noise than an old pickup already did. I leaned over my steering wheel to look up at the moon through the windshield. There were barely any stars visible, which was way out of the ordinary. If you've ever been to Appalachia, primarily the sparsely populated areas where I'm from, and see the Milky Way on clear nights, absence of stars back home only due to cloud cover or whatever in the hell went on this particular night. I rounded a particularly sharp left hand curve and chugged through a straight stretch. For the next right-hander, I looked at the ancient, decaying barn I always gazed at when riding that stretch of road. Thought about how long that thing had been there, and how many advancements in civilization it had seen. For the split second that my gaze wandered, a very large, sickly dog ran out in front of my truck. No more than 10 feet in front of me. Old Betsy was a good truck, but she didn't stop well. I heard the fence posts I had left in my truck bounce up out of my bed and back into it as I slid to a stop. My first thought was, oh God, I'll have to go tell these neighbors I ran over their dog. That doesn't go real far with people around here. It really kind of set them off, depending on the dog and the person. As I sat there breathing in the smell of burning rubber, something else found its way into my nose. The stench of rotting flesh. It's not a smell you ever forget. You smell it one time. Didn't pay much attention to it at the time. I just chalked it up some rotting roadkill nearby. Finally, I thought to myself, let me go check to see who this dog belongs to. I pushed my clutch in, shifted to reverse, and as I looked into my rearview mirror, illuminated by the haunting glow of my reverse lamps, was the same dog. Only it wasn't on four legs anymore. It stood up like a man well over 10 feet tall. Only then did it dawn on me. The front of my truck was every bit of 5 feet tall, and this dog was every bit of 5 feet tall at the shoulder on all fours. As it turned its head to look in the direction of my truck, I caught only a glimpse of this creature. It was not a dog. It was not a man. It was somewhere in between, and at the same time entirely separate altogether. Its skin hung loose off of its emaciated and thin frame like a raccoon. Bits of matted fur, dirt, and mud clung to its leg like a disease. The right arm seemed a little longer than the left. They both hung abnormally low in relation to either animal the creature seemed to be. As it regained its senses, it turned and looked into the mirror like it knew exactly where I was sitting. The face was that of a man's, but the very edges of its face seemed to not be totally defined. They seemed to move and change like something you'd see at a cellular level in a scientific documentary. There were no eyes, but only sockets where eyes should have been. No hair, and the skin was dripping off its face. The cold, lifeless gray color. The nose was short and shoved into its face like a bulldog. The teeth still haunt me. It was definitely carnivorous, true to form of the rest of us. Its unnatural look Many of the teeth didn't seem to be arranged in a natural way in its mouth. They seemed to fill and spill forth from the indefinable face, almost like they knew the horror they occupied and they were searching for a way out. It stared through my life into my eyes and past my soul. It seemed like an eternity, but it could not have been more than 5 seconds that I sat there paralyzed. A light came on at the house next to the road, causing the creature to snap its gaze in that direction and tear off into the woods on his back two legs like a man. I jammed my old truck into first gear and roasted tires all the way through first, snatched second gear and drove as fast as I could home. When I got to the house, both my parents were asleep. I went downstairs in my bedroom and loaded every firearm I possessed and locked all the doors. I couldn't wake them up. Would believe that, and at 10:30 on a Thursday night, the basement was eerily quiet that night, and their dogs that got up to raise hell outside animals at all hours of the night were dead silent. The old post in the beam house didn't even creak or pop that night, as was usual. At about 3 a.m., I started to finally get drowsy, and as I went to lay my head down to get some sleep, so I could still attempt hiking the next morning, I smelled the stench of death again. It was faint at first, but it was definitely there. I thought to myself, you're just going crazy. None of that stuff was real. As I dwelt on it, it became more and more noticeable until it filled the entire basement. My dad has a home office in the basement with two large glass doors that face Escott National Forest and impenetrable 500,000-acre woods. I finally worked up the courage to walk out of my bedroom and into the basement living room with the little tactical 12-gauge loaded tack light on. I covered the flashlight with my hand so as not to make my presence known until need be. As I turned right out of the living room to my father's office, I shined the light through the glass doors. At the edge of the woods, there stood the creature. It was motionless. It stared right into the light, unafraid, with those soulless sockets devoid of eyes. I quickly covered my tactical light, ran into the living room, flipped on the outdoor floodlights. To my surprise, it was no longer standing at the edge of the woods, but between the house and the edge of the woods, motionless. I swung the door open and fired every round I had in its direction. I must have scored a couple hits because it screeched an unearthly scream, like that of a woman being slaughtered, as it took off into the woods. The dogs went crazy. Mom and Dad woke up asking me what the hell I was doing. I told them that a bear had gotten into the trash and was scaring it away. They didn't believe me, but I knew they wouldn't believe the truth either. I didn't sleep that night, or any time until the following Sunday. Everything seemed to return to normal, and I didn't think about the creature again until I met my wife about 6 years later. Her mother's house sits at the mouth of the holler, no more than 4 or 5 miles up the road from my mother and the father's. Up on the side of the holler, there are kennels for her brother's hunting dogs, no longer in use, haven't been in years. But the fence is still there, and the concrete pad is still there. It's a thing of great use when you need to quarantine an animal. Her Great Pyrenees had gone into a tussle with the raccoon, which of course he destroyed, but his rabies vaccination had lapsed, so we had to keep him quarantined for a time. It didn't bother him. Kind of like solitude. This particular night that we were coming home from a movie date in a neighboring town was the last night of quarantine for him. So we walked up the trail using our phone flashlights to get to the kennel, and there he sat, patiently waiting, tail wagging, happy to see us. We put him on a leash and started walking back to the house with him. As we were walking back through the darkness, I started to feel the same feeling I'd felt the night I hit the creature in my truck. I didn't say anything so as not to alarm my wife, but then the smell came wafting in on the breeze. She jokingly told me, "My God, what did you eat? You stink." I half-assed laughed, not being able to fully appreciate the joke for the horrors that raged within my mind. She immediately caught on and asked me what was wrong, which I only replied, "I'll tell you later." She grew up in the woods and around hunting and things of that nature her whole life, so she knew what I meant. Knew we were being watched by something. When we could see the lights of the house from the trail to the kennel, we heard it. There came barking from the kennel that sounded like the great Pyrenees we had on a leash next to us. It was a perfect imitation. The Pyrenees, being a guardian dog, immediately sensed that something was wrong. And so he turned to face the danger, belting out deep barks and growls in that direction. I don't know if you've ever had to drag a 150-pound dog, but it sucks and is no easy task. I'm 6 feet tall and 240 pounds. All I could do was get him back to the house. That barking never ceased the entire time we were running towards the house. In fact, it seemed to grow closer, until it seemed to be coming from inside my own head. Her mother heard the commotion and flipped the floodlights on as we made it to the fence of the yard, and I caught a glimpse of something coming to a dead stop at the end where the light reached, wheeling around and tearing off back into the darkness. My wife looks at me and goes, "Want to tell me what that was?" To which I replied, "Yes, let's go inside." I told the story and she listened, hanging on every word. Her family came from a long line of granny witches and other supernatural healers of the Appalachians. So her older sister came over the next morning with some herbs and chants to bless the property and to ward off evil. I suggested we go up to the dog kennels and do them as well. When we got to the kennels, they were completely destroyed. The very concrete foundation was cracked, and the chain link fence was torn off its post. The dog houses were destroyed, and the place reeked of the stench that followed the creature. My wife's older sister just went about her business like normal, blessed the place, burnt some herbs, and led us back into the property. When we got into the house, she wheeled about us suddenly and instructed us very firmly to never go into the woods after dark, until this thing left me alone. To make a long story short, my wife joined the military. She ended up getting stationed in Delaware. Well, as someone who's lived around fairly large mountains, endless wilderness their entire life, Delaware is pretty terrible. At least that was my thought when we first moved into the middle of a 50,000 plus population city. Fortunately, though, it didn't take us long to find a house in a sleepy little community further south. We purchased the house and moved in with haste. We were both very grateful and glad to be out of the city and into a rural setting again. The land in Delaware seems lifeless in comparison to Appalachia. Sparsely populated woods don't possess any energy. It goes one way or another. The ground doesn't seem to be alive like it is in Appalachia. Having no thought about the creature in a long time, I resumed my staying outside after dark, playing with our dogs in our rather large yard that borders a small patch of woods. Well, last night, I went outside to play with the dogs, and as dark set in, I built a decent-sized fire in my fire pit and consumed some good old-fashioned Appalachian Mountain cough syrup from a mason jar. Just as the fire was dying down, my bulldog tore off towards the woods. He has a habit of running off to go on adventures, so my immediate instinct was to chase him down in the yard and tackle him so he could not get away. As I tackled him to the ground and threw him in a fireman's carry on my shoulders, I heard him begin to bark. Only the barking was not coming from him. The only sound coming from him was a deep rumbling growl. A noise I've never heard him make. The threatening noise. Something was definitely wrong. As I ran with him on my shoulders back to the house, the stench of death again began to fill the air. 2 other dogs must have caught wind of what was happening and met me at the back door, which I threw open, slammed shut, locked, and again loaded my firearms. What could have followed us up 600 miles up here? As I flipped my floodlights on at the back of the house, several of the bushes and small trees at the forest edge were still shaking. Something had just run through them. My dogs went crazy all night, barking and howling and attempting to get out of the windows. I didn't sleep a bit, and I don't think I will for a while. I know for sure I won't be in the woods after dark ever again in my life. Not until this thing is gone.